Pavlov's aim was to discover what caused saliva to flow. He rerouted the salivary ducts to the outside of his dog's cheek so that he could collect and measure the spittle. Perhaps he thought the production of saliva might be the result of a fixed nervous reflex, like a knee jerk.
5 минут 42,5 секунды.
After taking many measurements of spittle, he confirmed that the dogs drooled automatically when their tongues touched food. He called the response the salivation reflex.
4,5. Хорошая собачка. Я предлагаю поменять собаку.
But his work started to run into trouble. As his dogs became familiar with the experimental routine, they started to fill their cheek tubes before Pavlov had a chance to stimulate their tongues. The dogs were learning to anticipate food. Pavlov tried a new technique. He erected screens so that the dogs couldn't see what was going on. Before passing meat through the hatch, he introduced a stimulus that was totally unrelated to feeding. A ticking metronome. At first, the dog dripped saliva into its cheek tube only when the food appeared. But after a number of trials, the dog began to connect the ticking with the arrival of meat. Soon, the sound alone made the dog drool. Eventually, the dog salivated as much to the ticking itself as it did originally to the presentation of food.
Полная. Идите сюда. Что я говорил?
He called this new response the conditioned reflex.
Собака.
Whatever the stimulus, his dogs could soon be conditioned to produce saliva. Pavlov believed that he had discovered how animals learned, even in the wild.
Most people reflexively respond to yelling with fear. So the drill instructors yell at the recruits. In this case, yelling is an unconditioned stimulus that elicits the unconditioned reflex of fear.
Okay, aye, sir. Aye, sir. Let me tell you something right now. Who is going to take you seriously if you don't talk with some conviction? No, shut up. I didn't ask for an answer.
First, he's going to use a voice. Now, some of the way we get our responses, recruits don't like the shouting voice.
This yelling is paired with the neutral stimulus of the drill instructor's hat, the distinctive campaign cover.
We call it cover identification. For us, it's a visual identification that they're going to sit there and focus on because they know this cover represents the Marine drill instructor.
Soon, the cover alone triggers a fear response, whether or not the drill instructor is yelling. The neutral stimulus has become a conditioned stimulus, and the unconditioned reflex of fear is now a conditioned response.
The recruits know that this represents a drill instructor. If I take this off, they might see me in a different light for a chance. When I put it back on, the recruits will respond and turn differently to me.
During the 3 decades Pavlov studied classical conditioning, he noticed two important variations called stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination.
Stimulus generalization is where you respond not only to the original conditioned stimulus, but other similar conditioned stimuli. So the way Pavlov did this with dogs, he could condition a dog to salivate to a tone, and then he could condition the dog to salivate to a higher pitched tone or a lower pitched tone, and the dog would salivate regardless of whether the tone was high pitched or low pitched.
Little Albert is a perfect example of stimulus generalization. While he was conditioned to fear a white rat, his fear response generalized to include other white furry things. Remember, even Santa's beard triggered this response.
Stimulus discrimination is basically just the opposite, where you respond to the original conditioned stimulus, but not other similar conditioned stimuli. So if we stay with the same example, Pavlov could condition the dog to salivate only to, we'll say, a medium-pitched tone, but not to a high-pitched or a low-pitched tone. The dog is discriminating between those similar stimuli.
Another example of stimulus discrimination would be if a Marine encountered a national park ranger who wears a hat similar to his drill instructor. Would he respond with the same fear? Probably not. The Marine would make a distinction between the two hats and the persons wearing them and respond appropriately. He is able to discriminate between the two stimuli.
You understand me? Yes, sir! Go help someone! Go! Yes, sir!
As we've seen, classical conditioning explains how we learn involuntary reflexive responses to stimuli that wouldn't ordinarily trigger that response.
You're moving too slow! Fix my right eye, sir! Aye, sir!
In the early part of the 20th century, psychologists John Watson and Rosalie Rayner set out to teach a baby boy called Little Albert to fear white rats using the principle of classical conditioning. This is a film of their work. The film shows several phases of their study. First, as you see here, the investigators demonstrated that prior to conditioning, Little Albert had no fears of any animals, including, of course, white rats. Watson and Rayner then sought to teach Albert to fear white rats through classical conditioning. In the conditioning phase of the study, which was not filmed, the investigators struck a steel bar with a hammer whenever Albert reached for a rat, making a very loud noise that greatly upset and frightened Albert. After 6 such pairings of the loud noise and the rat, it was believed that the boy had been conditioned to fear white rats. That is, Albert was now expected to react fearfully to white rats whether the rats were paired with loud noises or not. In this next film sequence, we see Albert interacting with a white rat after the conditioning process. The investigators believed that the child's reaction during this trial demonstrated his newly acquired fear of white rats. Finally, the investigators expected that little Albert's conditioned fear of white rats would generalize to stimuli that were similar in key ways to a white rat. In this film segment, they were trying to demonstrate that the child now also reacted fearfully to similar objects, such as a rabbit, a dog, a furry object, and a white mask worn by Watson himself.
consequences lead to changes in voluntary behavior. So how does operant conditioning work? There are two main components in operant conditioning: reinforcement and punishment. Reinforcers make it more likely that you'll do something again, while punishers make it less likely. Reinforcement and punishment can be positive or negative, but this doesn't mean good and bad. Positive means the addition of a stimulus, like getting dessert after you finish your veggies, and negative means the removal of a stimulus, like getting a night of no homework because you did well on an exam. Let's look at an example of operant conditioning. After eating dinner with your family, you clear the table and wash the dishes. When you're done, your mom gives you a big hug and says, "Thank you for helping me." In this situation, your mom's response is positive reinforcement if it makes you more likely to repeat the operant response, which is to clear the table and wash the dishes. Operant conditioning is everywhere in our daily lives. There aren't many things we do that haven't been influenced at some point by operant conditioning. We even see operant conditioning in some extraordinary situations. One group of scientists showed the power of operant conditioning by teaching pigeons to be art connoisseurs. Using food as a positive reinforcer, scientists have taught pigeons to select paintings by Monet over those by Picasso. When showed works of other artists, scientists observed stimulus generalization as the pigeons chose the Impressionists over the Cubists. Maybe next they'll condition the pigeons to paint their own masterpieces.
Harvard psychologist B.F. Skinner seeks nothing less than the engineering of human nature. In experiments with subjects as simple as pigeons, Skinner declares that with the right social engineering, we can create a new breed of human being. Skinner is firmly in the behaviorist tradition pioneered by John Watson in the 1920s. Like Watson, Skinner contends that with the right tools, we can predict and control behavior.
Skinner really inherited the mantle from Watson of behaviorism in this country. But it's kind of interesting to think about how there's a subtle difference in the way they went about it. Watson, as we know, ended up becoming an advertising executive, ended up embracing the American value system as it existed. Skinner was different. Skinner was a visionary. Skinner felt that through behaviorism, he could influence the world towards a greater humanity. Not meet humanity where it was, but take humanity to a new place through the principles of behaviorism.
Picking up where Watson left off, Skinner wants to do the rigorous science to prove that environment is everything. Change the environment, he argues, and you can change the individual. Or in Skinner's case, the pigeon.
Skinner himself was a born gadgeteer. He had, in his own early years, as a boy, for example, he developed ways of sorting ripe, I think it was cranberries, from unripe cranberries. He invented a cannon that would shoot things over his neighbor's fence. This was the kind of man he was. He was developing new ways to do everyday things in ways that were more comfortable, more efficient.
During World War II, Skinner had developed a pigeon guidance device for the U.S. military. While the Russians had dogs carrying bombs, and the Swedes had seals to blow up mines, Skinner had a plan of his own. Teaching pigeons to guide missiles to an enemy target. At the time, however, the military had no missiles to guide. But Skinner's pigeon research did not go to waste. He develops a system called operant conditioning to prove that a behavior will be repeated by a subject when rewarded. Repetition leads to reinforcement. Reinforcement to changes in behavior.
This hungry pigeon is moving about more or less at random. Sometimes it turns its head to the left. When it does, we reinforce that movement by giving the pigeon access to a dish of grain.
Skinner then waits for it to turn further. Again, more food. Ultimately, the pigeon will turn in a complete circle, having learned that only when he turns will he be rewarded.
What Skinner was able to do in very carefully controlled studies with animal models was they demonstrate that whole chains of behaviors could be built step by step so that literally you could teach a pigeon to do complicated behaviors that no one would have predicted possible.
And Skinner believes that if it works for pigeons, why not people? In Skinner's mind, behavior is behavior, up and down the evolutionary scale, and it is all learned. One of the great successes is in education. People are taught to do more complicated tasks than anyone had thought possible by breaking down behavior into small steps and giving positive reinforcement along the way.
The essence of Skinner's work was that we could manipulate the environment in ways that would permit us to produce any kind of behavior that we wished, and we could develop individuals in ways that made every possible future open to them.
The idea that anything is possible.
But what about voluntary behavior, like marching or making a bed? How do we learn those?
Now, we all remember where our head was, right? Yes, sir. Now, utilizing the buddy system, you got doggone 3 minutes. Exactly 3 minutes to make the bottom rack. You understand me? Yes, sir. No, wait, you understand me? Yes, sir. No, louder. Do you understand me? Yes, sir. Do it now, move. Go, 0. 0.
Edward L. Thorndike was the first psychologist to systematically investigate how we learn new voluntary behaviors. Later, American psychologist B.F. Skinner became famous for defining the principles of this important form of learning. Skinner coined the term operant to describe behaviors that operate upon the environment and generate consequences.
I would define operant conditioning as shaping and maintaining behavior by making sure that reinforcing consequences follow. Let me give you an example. Suppose we have a pigeon here. It's an ordinary pigeon, but it's quite peacefully walking around in a small space. We watch it and notice what it's doing. Then we decide to condition some bit of its behavior. Suppose we take turning to the left a little bit. The pigeon is hungry, and we can give it a bit of food as what we call a reinforcer. It's a reinforcing consequence. We wait until it turns to the left and then immediately give it a bit of food. Almost at once we can see that it's turning to the left more rapidly than it did before, or more often.
Reinforcement makes it more likely that we will repeat a behavior. Often, we're not even aware that this learning is taking place.
There's a story about a professor who had criticized me publicly on television, and his students decided to shape his behavior. And so they agreed in advance that they would not smile or nod unless he was standing on one corner of this platform. And very soon he spent the time standing there. And then they arranged that they would not smile or nod unless he was facing the blackboard. And they told me that at the end of the hour he was lecturing, facing the blackboard and talking over his shoulder.
There are two types of reinforcement. Positive reinforcement makes it more likely that we will repeat a behavior because we want more of the reinforcer. For example, even though the professor wasn't aware of how his behavior was being shaped, he adjusted his position in response to the student's smiles and nods. On the other hand, negative reinforcement makes it more likely we will repeat a behavior because we want to avoid a consequence. For instance, we are likely to repeat the behavior of paying our bills on time because we want to avoid the consequence of a late charge. Likewise, we are likely to repeat the behavior of taking vitamin C because we want to avoid the consequence of getting a cold.
Let's go! Now, eyeballs! Play, sir! Eyeballs! Play, sir! Eyeballs! Play, sir! Eyeballs! Play, sir! Straight!
Both positive and negative reinforcement can be found in the Marine Corps Basic Training Program. But the one the most people associate with boot camp is negative reinforcement. The recruits learn from the drill instructors just how effective this type of conditioning can be.
We believe